I was sitting on my private dock watching the sunrise over Lake Hamilton in Hot Springs, Arkansas, when I saw 3 cars pulling up my driveway at 7 in the morning. The lead vehicle was a white Mercedes SUV that I recognized immediately, and my stomach dropped because I knew exactly who was behind the wheel. Brenda Morrison stepped out first, her blonde bob perfectly styled despite the early hour, wearing a crisp white pantsuit that probably cost more than my monthly mortgage payment. She was the president of the Lakeside Meadows Homeowners Association, and in the 3 years since I had moved into this community, she had made it her personal mission to make my life as difficult as possible. Behind her emerged 4 other board members, all clutching folders and tablets like they were headed to a corporate takeover meeting instead of harassing a neighbor before breakfast. I stood up from my folding chair and walked down the dock toward the shore, my bare feet making soft sounds against the weathered wood planks. The dock had been here when I bought the property, a beautiful 60-foot structure that extended into the clear waters of the lake. It was one of the main reasons I had purchased this house in the first place. There was something peaceful about sitting out here in the mornings with my coffee, watching the mist rise off the water while the rest of the world slowly woke up. "Quinton Xavier," Brenda called out, her voice sharp and carrying easily across the quiet morning air. "We need to have a discussion with you about this structure." She gestured dramatically at my dock, as if it were some kind of monstrosity instead of a well-maintained piece of property that had existed for over 40 years. I had done my research when I bought the place. The previous owner, an elderly gentleman named Robert Chen, had built the dock in 1982 with all the proper permits and permissions. Everything was completely legal and above board. "Good morning to you too, Brenda," I said, keeping my voice level despite the irritation building in my chest. "What seems to be the problem?" "The problem," she said, practically spitting the words, "is that your private dock is creating an unfair advantage over other homeowners in the community. We have received multiple complaints about the aesthetic impact and the exclusive use of communal lakefront access." I blinked at her, genuinely confused. "Communal lakefront access? Brenda, this is my property. My deed specifically includes the land all the way to the water's edge and the dock. I have the paperwork." One of the other board members, a thin man named Gerald who always looked perpetually nervous, stepped forward with his tablet. "Actually, Mr. Xavier, at our last HOA meeting, we voted to reassess all lakefront properties and their associated structures. The community has decided that private docks create an inequitable distribution of lake access and diminish property values for homes that are not directly on the water." "You voted?" I felt my temper starting to rise. "You voted on my property? How does that even work?" Brenda crossed her arms, a triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The HOA has the authority to maintain community standards and ensure fair access to shared resources. We have determined that the lake should be considered a shared resource, and therefore your private dock must be removed. You have 30 days to comply, or we will fine you $500 per day until the structure is dismantled." I stared at her in disbelief. "You cannot be serious. I own this property. I have the deed. The dock was here when I bought the house, and it has been here for over 40 years. You have absolutely no right to demand I tear it down." "We have every right," another board member chimed in, a woman named Patricia, who always dressed like she was attending a country club luncheon. "It is all outlined in the HOA covenants. When you purchased your home, you agreed to abide by HOA rules and decisions. This was a democratic vote, and the majority has spoken." "Let me see these covenants," I demanded. "Show me exactly where it says the HOA can seize private property that was legally constructed and has existed for decades." Gerald fumbled with his tablet, scrolling through documents. Section 7, subsection 4 states that the HOA maintains authority over all structures visible from common areas, and that any structure deemed to create inequality among residents can be subject to removal or modification. "That is the biggest load of garbage I have ever heard," I said flatly. "That section refers to things like fence heights and exterior paint colors, not private property that was legally constructed before the HOA even existed." "When was this HOA established, Brenda?" Her smile faltered slightly. "The Lakeside Meadows HOA was officially incorporated in 1995. And my dock was built in 1982, I said, 13 years before your HOA existed, which means it is grandfathered in under any reasonable interpretation of property law. You have no authority here. Brenda's face flushed red, and I could see her jaw clenching. She did not like being contradicted, especially not in front of the other board members. We will see about that. The vote has been cast and the decision is final. You have 30 days, Mr. Xavier. I suggest you start making arrangements. They turned to leave, but I called after them. I am not tearing down my dock, Brenda. If you want to push this, I will see you in court. She looked back over her shoulder, and the expression on her face sent a chill down my spine. It was pure, vindictive satisfaction. I look forward to it. After they left, I stood on my lawn for a long moment, trying to process what had just happened. The whole situation was absurd. How could an HOA possibly think they had the right to demand I destroy a structure on my own property? I had bought this house specifically because it came with lake access and the dock. It was in my deed. I had title insurance. Everything was legitimate. I went inside and immediately started digging through my filing cabinet, pulling out all the paperwork from when I had purchased the house 3 years ago. The deed was clear. The property included not just the house and the 2 acres of land, but also extended to include the dock and the lake bed beneath it. That last part caught my attention. I had skimmed over it when I first bought the place, not really understanding the significance. The property description read, including all structures, improvements, and riparian rights, as well as ownership of the lake bed extending from the shoreline to a depth of 60 feet and a width of 100 feet, as deeded in the original land grant of 1891. 1891. That was oddly specific. I grabbed my laptop and started doing some research into the history of my property. It took several hours of digging through county records, historical documents, and old land surveys, but eventually I started to piece together something remarkable. When Lake Hamilton was created in 1932 as part of a hydroelectric project, most of the surrounding land was purchased by a development company that planned to build vacation homes around the lake. However, a small section of the shoreline, including where my house now stood, had been privately owned since before Arkansas even became a state. The original land grant dated back to 1891, when a man named Theodore Quincy had been given a large tract of land as payment for services rendered to the territorial government. When the lake was created, the development company had tried to purchase Theodore's land, but he had refused. Instead, he had negotiated an agreement that allowed the lake to flood a portion of his property in exchange for maintaining ownership of the lakebed itself underneath the water. This was not uncommon in the early days of reservoir creation, when property rights were still being sorted out, and landowners had more negotiating power than they would today. The land had passed through several owners over the decades, and apparently none of them had fully understood or exercised the rights that came with that original land grant. When Robert Chen had built the dock in 1982, he had known about the lakebed ownership but had not made a big deal about it. The dock was simply for his own personal use, and he had not cared about asserting his legal rights beyond that. But now, looking at the documents spread across my dining room table, I realized I was sitting on something much bigger than just a private dock. If I actually owned the lakebed extending 60 feet out and 100 feet wide, that meant I owned a substantial portion of the underwater land in front of my property. And if Brenda and her HOA cronies wanted to claim the lake was a shared resource, they were about to get a very rude awakening. I spent the next week consulting with a property attorney named Michael Torres, who specialized in real estate and water rights. When I showed him my deed and the historical documents I had uncovered, his eyes widened. "This is extraordinary," he said, spreading the papers across his desk. "Do you realize what you have here? You do not just own a dock, you own a significant portion of the actual lake. The lakebed itself is your property, which means anyone who wants to use that section of water for boating, fishing, or any other purpose is technically doing so on your private property." "So the HOA has no right to demand I remove my dock?" I asked. "They have less than no right," Michael said with a laugh. "They are threatening to seize property that is unequivocally yours, and moreover, they do not seem to understand that you could actually prevent any of the community members from using the section of the lake above your lakebed. Now, I am not saying you should do that, but legally, you would be within your rights." "What do you recommend?" I asked. Michael leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his lips thoughtfully. "Let them follow through with their threats. Wait for them to actually assess the fines or take action. Then we hit them with the full legal response, including the Lakebed ownership documentation. If they are smart, they will back down immediately. If they are not smart, well, this could get very interesting." I followed his advice. When the 30-day deadline arrived, I received a certified letter from the HOA informing me that I was now being fined $500 per day for non-compliance with the dock removal order. The letter was signed by Brenda and included a smug little note at the bottom saying that all fines must be paid within 10 days, or the HOA would place a lien on my property. That was when Michael filed our response. He submitted a comprehensive legal brief to the HOA board, with copies to each individual board member, laying out the complete history of the property ownership and the lakebed rights. The brief included certified copies of the original 1891 land grant, the 1932 agreement with the Lake Development Company, every subsequent deed transfer, and a professional survey that clearly marked the boundaries of my underwater property. The brief also included a cease and desist order demanding that the HOA immediately rescind the fines and withdraw their demands regarding the dock. It further stated that any HOA member or community resident who used the section of Lake Hamilton above my lakebed without my express written permission was trespassing on private property and could be subject to legal action. I expected Brenda to back down after receiving this information. Any reasonable person would have recognized they were in the wrong and moved on. But Brenda Morrison was not a reasonable person. 3 days after Michael sent the brief, I received a phone call from an unknown number. When I answered, a woman's voice snapped, "This is Brenda Morrison. Your little legal stunt is not going to work. The HOA has consulted with our own attorney, and we have determined that your so-called lakebed ownership is invalid. Lake Hamilton is a public waterway, which means it is subject to public use regardless of any antiquated land grants. You cannot own a lake." "I do not own the lake, Brenda," I said calmly. "I own a specific section of the lakebed underneath the water. That is very different, and it is completely legal. My attorney has provided you with all the documentation you need. I suggest you take it seriously." "What I suggest," she hissed, "is that you remove your dock before this gets ugly. The HOA is prepared to take every legal action available to enforce community standards. We have already filed a complaint with the county about unpermitted structures, and we are prepared to take you to court for violating HOA covenants." "Please do," I said. "I look forward to seeing you there." She hung up without another word. 2 days later, I got a visit from a county building inspector who wanted to verify the permits for my dock. I showed him the original permits from 1982, along with inspection records showing the dock had been properly maintained and updated over the years. The inspector spent about 20 minutes examining the structure, checking his records, and taking photos. "Everything looks in order, Mr. Xavier," he said finally. "The dock is grandfathered under current building codes, and all the original permits were properly filed. I do not know why someone filed a complaint about this, but there is no violation here." "The HOA is trying to force me to tear it down," I explained. The inspector shook his head. "That is a civil matter between you and the HOA. From the county's perspective, this structure is completely legal. I will file a report saying as much." A week later, I received a summons. The Lakeside Meadows HOA was taking me to court, seeking an injunction to force the removal of my dock and to compel payment of the accumulated fines, which now totaled $7,000. The court date was set for 6 weeks out, giving both sides time to prepare their cases. Michael was positively gleeful when I showed him the summons. "This is exactly what we wanted," he said. "Now we get to present all our evidence in front of a judge, and the HOA is going to look absolutely foolish. Plus, since they are the ones who initiated the lawsuit, we can counterclaim for harassment, legal fees, and damages. This could get very expensive for them." Over the next few weeks, I watched as the situation escalated beyond anything I could have imagined. Brenda went on a campaign throughout the neighborhood, holding special meetings and sending out newsletters claiming I was trying to privatize public resources and steal the lake from the community. She painted me as some kind of greedy villain who wanted to prevent families from enjoying the water. The truth, of course, was nothing like that. I had never prevented anyone from using the lake. I had never complained about boats passing by my property or people fishing in the area. All I wanted was to keep my own dock on my own property, which I had every legal right to do. But Brenda was not interested in truth. She was interested in winning. Some of my neighbors started giving me cold looks when I passed by. A few stopped talking to me altogether. One afternoon, I found my mailbox had been vandalized with spray paint, the words "Lake Thief" scrawled across it in red letters. I filed a police report, but there was not much the authorities could do without witnesses or security camera footage. The harassment got worse as the court date approached. Someone slashed my tires one night while my truck was parked in my driveway. Another time, I discovered garbage had been dumped on my lawn, including spoiled food and broken glass. I installed security cameras around my property and started documenting every incident. The cameras proved their worth 2 weeks before the trial, when they caught Brenda herself sneaking onto my property at night with 2 other HOA board members. They were carrying tools, and it was clear they intended to damage or destroy the dock. I watched on my phone's security app as they crept down toward the water, whispering to each other. I called the police immediately. The Garland County Sheriff's Department responded quickly, arriving before Brenda and her accomplices could do any real damage. The officers caught them red-handed on my dock with crowbars and a reciprocating saw. I met the deputies at the waterfront, where Brenda was arguing loudly that she had every right to be there because she was enforcing HOA regulations. The lead deputy, a patient man named Officer Matthews, was not buying it. "Madam, this is private property, and you are here at night with tools that appear intended for vandalism or destruction of property. The homeowner has video evidence of you trespassing. You need to come with us." "This is outrageous," Brenda shrieked. "I am the HOA president. This man is violating community standards. Someone has to take action." "That action would be through the legal system, madam, not by taking matters into your own hands," Officer Matthews said firmly. "You are under arrest for criminal trespassing and attempted vandalism. Please put your hands behind your back." Watching Brenda Morrison get handcuffed on my dock while screaming about property rights and community standards was one of the more surreal experiences of my life. The other 2 board members, Gerald and Patricia, were also arrested. All 3 were taken to the county jail, where they would have to post bail. The next morning, the story was all over the local news. HOA president arrested. Attempting to destroy residents' dock, read the headline in the Hot Springs Sentinel. The article included details about the ongoing legal dispute and mentioned my Lakebed ownership, which many people in the community were hearing about for the first time. Public opinion started to shift after that. People began asking questions about why the HOA was so obsessed with my dock and why Brenda would go so far as to commit a crime. Other homeowners started coming forward with their own stories of HOA overreach and Brenda's bullying tactics. It turned out I was far from the only person who had been harassed by her and the board. When the court date finally arrived, the courtroom was packed. Michael had told me that HOA disputes usually attracted minimal attention, but this case had become something of a local sensation. There were residents from my neighborhood, reporters from several news outlets, and even a few people who had driven in from other parts of Arkansas just to watch the proceedings. Judge Patricia Hendricks presided over the case. She was a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s with a reputation for being fair but stern. The HOA had hired an attorney named Robert Blackwell, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who clearly thought this was going to be an easy win. Blackwell opened by arguing that the HOA had a duty to maintain community standards and that my dock violated those standards by creating an unfair advantage. He claimed that all residents of Lakeside Meadows should have equal access to the lake and that my private dock undermined that principle. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Blackwell said, gesturing dramatically, "the defendant's claim to own a portion of the lakebed is dubious at best. Lake Hamilton is a public reservoir created for the benefit of all citizens. No individual can own a public waterway, regardless of any historical documents they might produce." When it was our turn, Michael calmly and methodically dismantled every argument the HOA had made. He presented the complete chain of title for my property, starting with the 1891 land grant and continuing through every deed transfer up to my own purchase. He showed the original agreement from 1932 that specifically preserved the lakebed ownership rights when the reservoir was created. Your Honor, Michael said, the plaintiff seems to be confused about several fundamental legal principles. First, my client does not claim to own the lake itself. He owns a specific, clearly delineated section of the lakebed, which is the ground beneath the water. This is no different from owning land anywhere else, except that in this case, the land happens to be underwater. Second, the dock in question was legally constructed in 1982, 13 years before the HOA even existed. The HOA cannot retroactively apply rules to structures that predate its own incorporation. And third, perhaps most importantly, the HOA has absolutely no authority to seize or demand the removal of private property that exists entirely within the boundaries of my client's deeded land. He then presented the survey map showing exactly where my property ended and the public waterway began. The section of lakebed I owned extended 60 feet from the shoreline and 100 feet wide, perfectly encompassing my dock with room to spare. Judge Hendricks studied the documents carefully, asking several pointed questions about the historical land grants and the 1932 agreement. Michael had answers for everything, backed up by certified documents and expert testimony from a surveyor and a legal historian who specialized in Arkansas property law. When the HOA's attorney tried to argue that public access rights superseded private ownership, the judge cut him off. Counsel, I have reviewed the documentation provided by the defense, and it is quite clear. The lakebed ownership was properly preserved when the reservoir was created, and that ownership has been continuously maintained through every subsequent property transfer. Unless you have evidence that these documents are fraudulent or that the chain of title has been broken at some point, I do not see how you can claim the defendant does not own this property. Blackwell sputtered for a moment, then tried a different approach. Your Honor, even if the lakebed ownership is valid, the HOA still has the authority to regulate structures within the community for aesthetic purposes and to maintain property values. The dock was built in 1982, Judge Hendricks said flatly. The HOA was incorporated in 1995. How can the HOA regulate something that existed before the HOA itself? The defendant agreed to abide by HOA rules when he purchased the property, Blackwell argued. Did the HOA covenants existing at the time of purchase specifically mention docks or lakefront structures? The judge asked. Blackwell hesitated. Not specifically, Your Honor, but the general provisions about maintaining community standards. So the answer is no, Judge Hendricks interrupted. The defendant purchased a property that included a dock. The dock was legal, properly permitted, and had existed for decades. The HOA covenants did not mention lakefront structures, and now, years later, the HOA decides to pass a rule demanding the dock be removed. Does that about sum it up? Your Honor, with respect, the HOA has the right to evolve its rules as the needs of the community change, Blackwell said. Not when those rules attempt to seize private property without compensation, the judge replied. That is called an unconstitutional taking, Counselor. I'm surprised you would even attempt to argue otherwise. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, but it was clear which way the wind was blowing. Judge Hendricks was not impressed with the HOA's arguments, and she seemed particularly annoyed by the fact that Brenda and 2 other board members had been arrested for attempting to vandalize my property while the lawsuit was pending. When all the evidence had been presented and both sides had made their closing arguments, Judge Hendricks took a 30-minute recess to review her notes. When she returned, her decision was swift and unambiguous. I find in favor of the defendant, she announced. The evidence clearly shows that Mr. Xavier owns not only his dock, but also the lakebed upon which it sits. The HOA had no authority to demand removal of this structure, and their attempt to fine Mr. Xavier for refusing to comply with their unlawful demands was harassment. The HOA is ordered to immediately rescind all fines, issue a written apology to Mr. Xavier, and cease any further attempts to interfere with his legal use of his property. Furthermore, I am awarding Mr. Xavier his legal fees and costs to be paid by the HOA. Additionally, I am ordering the HOA to pay Mr. Xavier $10,000 in damages for harassment and emotional distress. She looked directly at the HOA board members sitting in the courtroom. Let me be very clear. If there are any further attempts to harass Mr. Xavier, to damage his property, or to interfere with his legal rights, I will not hesitate to hold the responsible parties in contempt of court. The behavior that led to the arrests of 3 board members was absolutely unacceptable, and I expect that matter to be dealt with appropriately in criminal court. This case is closed. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, and just like that, it was over. The HOA had lost completely, and they were now on the hook for my legal fees plus damages. Michael shook my hand with a huge grin on his face. That was even better than I hoped, he said. Judge Hendricks did not pull any punches. As we left the courtroom, several reporters tried to get comments from me. I kept it brief. I'm just glad this is resolved. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to keep my dock and live peacefully in my home. Hopefully the HOA will learn from this experience and treat homeowners with more respect going forward. The aftermath of the trial was dramatic. Brenda Morrison resigned as HOA president the next day, and Gerald and Patricia both stepped down from the board. The 3 of them still faced criminal charges for the attempted vandalism, which would be dealt with in a separate trial. The HOA called an emergency meeting to elect new leadership and to discuss how they were going to pay the judgment against them. It turned out that the HOA had significantly overextended itself. Between my legal fees, the damages, and the costs of their own attorney, the judgment came to nearly $70,000. The HOA's reserve fund had only about $30,000, which meant they would have to levy a special assessment against all the homeowners in the community to cover the shortfall. This did not go over well. Many homeowners were furious that they now had to pay hundreds or even thousands of dollars in special assessments because the old board had pursued a frivolous lawsuit and committed crimes in the process. A group of residents organized a recall effort and managed to replace most of the remaining board members with new people who promised to operate with more transparency and common sense. The criminal trial for Brenda, Gerald, and Patricia took place about 3 months later. All 3 were charged with criminal trespassing and attempted vandalism. The video evidence from my security cameras was damning. You could clearly see them entering my property without permission, approaching the dock with tools and discussing how they were going to take care of this problem once and for all. Gerald and Patricia took plea deals, agreeing to perform community service and pay restitution in exchange for having the charges reduced to misdemeanors. Brenda, stubborn to the end, insisted on fighting the charges. She claimed she was acting in the best interests of the community and that her actions were justified by her position as HOA president. The jury did not agree. After less than an hour of deliberation, they found her guilty on both counts. The judge sentenced her to 90 days in jail, suspended on the condition that she complete 200 hours of community service and stay away from Lakeside Meadows and me for 3 years. She was also ordered to pay $5,000 in restitution. Life slowly returned to normal after that. The new HOA board was much more reasonable, focusing on actual community needs like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events rather than harassing residents over trivial matters. They sent me a formal written apology for the previous board's actions and assured me that there would be no further issues with my dock. I even started to rebuild some relationships with my neighbors. Many of them apologized for believing Brenda's propaganda about me trying to steal the lake. Once people understood the actual facts, they realized I had done nothing wrong. Some of my neighbors even started using the section of lake above my lakebed for fishing and boating, and I never said a word about it. I had never wanted to exclude anyone from the water. I just wanted to protect my own property rights. One morning, about 6 months after the trial, I was sitting on my dock with my coffee, watching the sunrise like I always did. I heard footsteps on the wooden planks behind me and turned to see my neighbor from 2 houses down, an older woman named Dorothy Eckhart, who had always been kind to me even during the worst of the HOA drama. "Morning, Quinton," she said with a warm smile. "Mind if I join you?" "Not at all," I said, gesturing to the empty chair beside me. "Coffee?" "I brought my own," she said, holding up a thermos. She settled into the chair with a contented sigh. You know, I've been living in this neighborhood for 15 years, and I never really appreciated these sunrises until all this business with the dock happened. Made me think about what really matters. It is a beautiful spot, I agreed. I owe you an apology, Dorothy said. I should have stood up for you when Brenda was spreading all those lies. I knew you were not doing anything wrong, but I kept my mouth shut because I did not want to be her next target. That was cowardly of me. You do not need to apologize, I said. I understand. Brenda was a bully, and people do not stand up to bullies when they are afraid. Maybe so, but that does not make it right, Dorothy said. She took a sip of her coffee and looked out at the water. The new board asked me to join, you know. They want people who will actually serve the community instead of using the position as some kind of power trip. Are you going to do it? I asked. I think I might, she said. Someone needs to make sure this kind of thing never happens again. And I figure I owe it to the neighborhood after staying silent when I should have spoken up. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the light change on the water as the sun climbed higher. A couple of ducks paddled by, and somewhere in the distance I could hear someone starting up a boat motor. Can I ask you something? Dorothy said eventually. When you found out you owned the Lakebed, did you ever think about actually enforcing it? Like telling people they could not use that section of the lake? I thought about it for a moment. Honestly, no. I knew it was my right, but that was never what this was about for me. I just wanted to keep my dock. I never wanted to keep people off the water or cause problems for anyone. Brenda forced this whole situation by being unreasonable. If she had just left me alone, nobody would have ever known or cared about the Lakebed ownership. That is what I thought, Dorothy said with a nod. You are a good man, Quinton. This neighborhood is lucky to have you. After she left, I sat there for a while longer, thinking about everything that had happened over the past year. It had been stressful and expensive, and at times downright scary. But in the end, I had stood up for my rights and won. The dock was still here, still solid under my feet. My property was still mine. And the community had learned an important lesson about the limits of HOA authority and the importance of respecting individual property rights. I also thought about the deeper irony of the whole situation. Brenda had been so determined to take away my private dock in the name of community equality that she had never stopped to consider whether she actually had the right to do so. She had been so confident in the power of the HOA, so certain that rules and votes and community standards could override legal property ownership, that she had blinded herself to reality. And when she was confronted with the truth that I owned not just the dock but the lakebed beneath it, she had doubled down instead of backing off. She had committed crimes trying to get her way. She had destroyed her own reputation, cost the HOA tens of thousands of dollars, and ended up with a criminal record, all because she could not admit she was wrong. It was a cautionary tale about the dangers of petty tyranny, about what happens when people get a little bit of power and let it go to their heads. HOAs serve an important function in many communities, helping maintain property values and organizing collective action for things like shared amenities. But when they are run by people who see them as fiefdoms to be ruled rather than communities to be served, they can become instruments of harassment and overreach. The sun was fully up now, and the lake sparkled in the morning light. I finished my coffee and stood up, stretching my back. It was going to be a good day. I had work to do, some repairs around the house that I had been putting off, and later I was planning to take my kayak out for a paddle around the lake. As I walked back toward my house, I glanced at the dock behind me. It looked exactly the same as it always had, weathered wood and sturdy pilings, a simple structure that had stood here for over 40 years. But now it meant something different to me. It was not just a dock anymore. It was a symbol of the importance of standing up for your rights, of not backing down when you know you are in the right, even when the pressure is intense and it feels like everyone is against you. Over the following months, I noticed positive changes rippling through the entire Lakeside Meadows community. The new HOA board, led by Dorothy and several other level-headed residents, completely overhauled how the organization operated. They made all meetings open to any homeowner who wanted to attend, published detailed financial reports quarterly, and created a clear process for residents to appeal any decisions they disagreed with. They also reviewed all existing HOA rules and regulations, eliminating dozens of outdated or overly restrictive covenants. Things like the exact shade of mailbox paint, the specific types of flowers allowed in front yards, and the prohibition on pickup trucks parked in driveways all got thrown out. The new philosophy was simple: only regulate things that genuinely affected property values or community safety, and give homeowners as much freedom as possible to enjoy their properties. I was even invited to join one of the HOA committees, the one focused on waterfront issues. It made sense, given that I probably knew more about Lake Hamilton property rights than anyone else in the neighborhood after all my research. I accepted the invitation, figuring it was a good way to help prevent future conflicts and to make sure the HOA respected everyone's legal rights going forward. One interesting development came about 4 months after the trial. A homeowner named Frank Morrison, no relation to Brenda, approached me with a question. Frank lived 3 houses down from me, also on the waterfront, and he had been doing some research into his own property after hearing about my case. "Quinton, I think I might own part of the Lakebed too," he said, showing me his deed. "Look at this language here. It is almost identical to yours." I examined his documents and felt a jolt of recognition. He was right. His property had the same kind of historical language about lakebed ownership, though his section was smaller than mine, only extending 40 feet out and 50 feet wide. "Have you had it surveyed?" I asked. "Not yet, but I am planning to," Frank said. "The thing is, I want to build a dock, but after everything that happened with you, I am nervous about how the HOA will react." "The new board is much more reasonable," I assured him, "but if you want, I can introduce you to my attorney. He can help you verify your lakebed rights and make sure everything is documented properly before you start construction." Frank took me up on the offer, and Michael Torres helped him through the same process we had gone through. It turned out that Frank did indeed own his section of lakebed, and when he applied for a permit to build a dock, the new HOA board approved it without any fuss. That opened the floodgates. 3 other waterfront homeowners discovered they also had lakebed ownership rights buried in their old deeds. By the end of the year, Lakeside Meadows had 6 private docks instead of just 1, and the HOA had developed clear guidelines for how to handle waterfront construction that respected both individual property rights and community aesthetics. The criminal case aftermath also had some interesting consequences for Brenda. After completing her community service, she quietly moved away from Hot Springs. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she had relocated to Little Rock and was working in retail. The experience had apparently humbled her somewhat, though I never spoke to her again after the trial. Gerald and Patricia both stayed in the neighborhood but kept very low profiles. Gerald ended up selling his house about a year later and moving to Florida. Patricia remained but became something of a recluse, rarely attending community events and keeping to herself. I actually felt a bit sorry for both of them. They had gotten caught up in Brenda's crusade and made terrible decisions, but they had at least owned up to their mistakes and taken responsibility. As for me, life settled into a comfortable routine. I kept my job as an IT project manager working remotely for a company based in Dallas, which meant I could enjoy my lakefront property during the day and handle my work responsibilities from my home office. The dock became my favorite place to work when the weather was nice. There was something about being out on the water, with the gentle lapping of waves against the pilings and the occasional fish jumping, that helped me think clearly and focus. I also started a tradition of hosting an annual dock party every 4th of July. I would invite the whole neighborhood, set up a grill on the shore, and let people hang out on the dock to watch the fireworks that the city launched from a barge on the lake. It was my way of showing that I had never wanted to exclude anyone from enjoying the water. The first year, about 30 people showed up. The second year, it was more than 60. It became one of the neighborhood's favorite events. Dorothy turned out to be an excellent HOA board president. She had a gift for listening to people and finding compromises that satisfied different viewpoints. Under her leadership, the community actually came together in ways it never had when Brenda was in charge. People organized block parties, started a neighborhood watch program, and even created a community garden on some unused common land. The special assessment that homeowners had to pay to cover the legal judgment from my case became something of a rallying point. Instead of resenting me for it, most people directed their anger at the previous board for being so reckless and foolish. It became a cautionary tale within the community about the importance of choosing good leaders and holding them accountable. I did have one more encounter with the legal system related to the lakebed ownership, but this time it was much more pleasant. About 18 months after the original trial, I was contacted by a law professor at the University of Arkansas named Dr. Sarah Kerrigan, who was writing a book about water rights and riparian property law in the American South. "Your case is fascinating," she told me over the phone. "The preservation of pre-reservoir lakebed ownership rights is extremely rare. I have found only a handful of similar cases in the entire country, and yours is by far the best documented. Would you be willing to let me interview you for my book?" I agreed, and she drove down from Fayetteville to spend a day with me, reviewing all my documents and asking detailed questions about the legal process. She was particularly interested in the 1932 agreement that had preserved the lakebed rights when Lake Hamilton was created. "This is a masterclass in property rights negotiation," she said, examining the old documents with fascination. Theodore Quincy was clearly a savvy landowner who understood the value of what he was giving up and made sure he was properly compensated. And the fact that these rights survived multiple property transfers over nearly a century without being lost or forgotten until you bought the place is remarkable. "I almost did not notice it myself," I admitted. "I skimmed right over that section of the deed when I bought the house. It was only when the HOA challenged my doc that I went back and really studied the property description." "Which means if Brenda Morrison had just left you alone, you probably never would have asserted your lakebed rights, Doctor," Kerrigan said with a laugh. "She literally created the problem she was trying to prevent. That is delicious irony." Her book came out about a year later, and she sent me an autographed copy. An entire chapter was dedicated to my case, using it as an example of how historical property rights can create unexpected legal situations in modern contexts. She also used it to discuss the limits of HOA authority and the importance of understanding property law before making aggressive legal moves. The publicity from the book led to a few more media interviews, including one with a regional magazine that did a feature story on Lake Hamilton property rights. The article brought some attention to the historical aspects of the lake and led to a local history group creating an exhibit about the formation of Lake Hamilton and the people who had lived on the land before the reservoir was created. I even got involved with that effort, donating copies of my historical documents to the Garland County Historical Society and helping them research other properties around the lake that might have similar unusual ownership situations. It turned out there were a few others, though none quite as clear-cut as mine. Time moved on, as it always does. 3 years after the original conflict, the neighborhood had been completely transformed. The old culture of petty enforcement and harassment that had defined the Brenda Morrison era was gone, replaced by a genuine sense of community and mutual respect. Property values actually increased after the new board took over, which was ironic given that Brenda had always claimed her strict enforcement was necessary to maintain values. I remained in my house, enjoying my dock and my lakefront property. I never took for granted how close I had come to losing it. If I had not stood up for my rights, if I had not been willing to fight back against the HOA's overreach, I would have been forced to tear down the dock that had first attracted me to this property. And I never would have discovered the remarkable history of the land I owned. The experience taught me several important lessons. First, always read your property documents carefully and understand exactly what you own. Second, do not back down when you know you are legally right, even if the fight seems daunting. Third, bullies often back down when confronted with firm resistance and solid facts. And fourth, communities work better when they are based on respect and reason rather than arbitrary rules and petty enforcement. My dock still stands today, weathered and sturdy, extending 60 feet into Lake Hamilton just as it has for over 40 years. The lakebed beneath it, that 100-foot wide stretch of underwater land, remains mine as it has been since 1891. And every morning, when I sit out there with my coffee and watch the sun rise over the Arkansas hills, I remember the fight it took to protect this place and feel grateful that I stood my ground. The Lakeside Meadows community continues to thrive under reasonable leadership. Dorothy served 3 terms as board president before passing the torch to another good leader. The neighborhood has become known in the Hot Springs area as one of the most desirable places to live, not because of strict rules and vigorous enforcement, but because of a genuine sense of community and respect for individual rights. And As for Brenda Morrison and her crusade to take my dock, it has become a legend in Hot Springs HOA circles, a cautionary tale told at board meetings and community gatherings, the story of the HOA president who tried to seize a resident's private dock and discovered he owned the entire lakebed underneath, leading to her own arrest, the HOA's financial disaster, and her ultimate disgrace. It is a reminder that property rights matter, that rules must be based on legal authority, and that no amount of community voting can override fundamental ownership rights. I still get asked about it sometimes when new residents move into the neighborhood and hear the story. I always tell them the same thing. I never wanted any of this. I just wanted to keep my dock and live peacefully. But when someone tries to take what is legally yours, you have an obligation to stand up for yourself, not just for your own sake, but to set a precedent that rights matter and cannot be casually trampled by people who think they have authority they do not actually possess. The lake continues its eternal rhythm, rising and falling slightly with the seasons, its surface reflecting the sky and the surrounding hills. Boats pass by my dock regularly, and I wave to the people on them. Fish jump in the early mornings and late evenings. Ducks make their homes in the shallows. And underneath it all, 60 feet deep and 100 feet wide, lies my little piece of the lakebed, a strip of land that has been privately owned since before Arkansas was a state, surviving the creation of the reservoir, surviving decades of ownership changes, and finally surviving an HOA's attempt to deny its existence. Every time I walk down that dock, I think about all the history beneath my feet. I think about Theodore Quincy negotiating to keep his land rights in 1932. I think about Robert Chen building this dock in 1982, probably never imagining it would someday be at the center of a legal battle. I think about all the quiet mornings and peaceful evenings this dock has witnessed over 4 decades. And I think about how close it came to being destroyed by people who thought community standards were more important than property rights, who thought voting could override legal ownership, who thought their vision of how things should be was more important than how things actually were. But it is still here. And I am still here. And the lakebed is still mine. The story has a happy ending, not just for me, but for the entire community. The old HOA's defeat led to real reforms that made life better for everyone. People feel more secure in their homes, knowing their property rights will be respected. The board focuses on things that actually matter instead of harassing residents over trivial violations, and the neighborhood has developed a real sense of community built on mutual respect rather than fear of the HOA. Sometimes justice works out exactly as it should. The bullies lose, the rights of individuals are protected, and the community learns important lessons that make it stronger going forward. This was one of those times. As I sit here on my dock, 6 years after Brenda Morrison first pulled up my driveway with her entourage of board members, I can honestly say I would not change a thing. Was it stressful? Absolutely. Was it expensive? Without question. Was it worth it? Every single penny and every sleepless night. Because principles matter, rights matter, and standing up for yourself matters, especially when powerful people think they can push you around. The sun is setting now, painting the lake in shades of orange and pink and purple. A light breeze ripples the surface of the water. Somewhere nearby, a fish breaks the surface with a gentle splash. And I am sitting on my dock, on my property, above my lakebed, exactly where I belong. This is my home. This is my dock. This is my lakebed. And no HOA vote will ever change that.